I'm sure there are certain things in your life that you can point to that you really like right now, and you like them more than other people do. Maybe it's jazz. Maybe it's, Shakespearean sonnets. Maybe it's coffee or wine or what have you. Things that some people like and others don't, and it's not even necessarily pleasant when you first encounter it, but you somehow manage nebulously to develop a taste for it. These are things that we all have experience with, where I'm doing something and I'm really into it, and the outside world can see it, whether it's playing a video game or having a cup of coffee or whatever it is. And they can kind of see the external trappings of what that experience is like, but still they look at it and go, yeah, I don't really understand why it is that you like that. So I had offered a long time ago that one of the interesting dynamics here is that we tend to acquire a taste for something. That's usually the phrase that we use, right? I acquired a taste for, coffee or wine or poetry. Most of the time, what that really means is that somewhere in my history, there was a catalytic experience where I experienced something and it surprised me by, wow, hey, that's good, you know? Like, oh, I've never had that fish before. That's actually really good. And so, what's important here is that you didn't even know to desire it beforehand, but afterwards you had acquired a taste for it. And so then you knew to desire it. And even more importantly, you continue to desire and continue to pursue that kind of thing, even being willing to accept inferior substitutes. That's the key. That's the key thing here. And so what we find then is that this is how a lot of really terrible restaurants survive, right? And this is how a lot of really terrible experiences survive, because someone will have a really good experience with something, and then they have 1,000 mediocre and inferior experiences because they're chasing that one thing. They're trying to get back and at least partially re-experience some of what it was that surprised them in being good in the original experience. Now, that dynamic was something that I had pointed out before in saying that, okay, well, I think in the context of, let's say, utilitarianism, especially John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism, he talks about, acquired tastes and how it is that, we have to know to acquire we have to know how it is to desire fine things. And the only way that you're going to know to desire fine poetry and fine philosophy or fine mathematics or whatever it is to actually have a good experience with it. And you have to have some kind of acquisition of that taste. You have to have some kind of good experience upon which to base your future desires. But the key dynamic here that I want to point out is that once you have that experience, that's something good, that you then, are willing to accept all kinds of inferior examples after that point, because all of those little examples are in some way allowing you to re-experience the goodness of that original thing. In other words, if you had experience, so for me, it's Cajun spices, at least in part. I went to school in New Orleans. The first time I went to graduate school was in New Orleans at Tulane, and we did all kinds of Mardi Gras stuff. And so there was, a lot of jambalaya and crawfish I'm not so fond of, but, good things with rice and beans, especially red beans and rice, good stuff. I still use Cajun spice for everything, and I love it. And it's something that if I had just added that to pasta when I was 12 or 13 years old or 15 or 16, I wouldn't have, it might have been good, but it wouldn't have been the same kind of thing. Whereas now, when I experience that and I add a little of it to basically any red sauce, then it allows me to partially bring back that experience. And so, in other words, part of my joy now in experiencing even an inferior example of the same thing is that it builds upon the goodness of the past experience. And this is something that extends all throughout human experience in the sense that I think this is part of what can be good for people about, let's say, going to mass or experiencing some kind of religious ritual, a concert. If you have a really good experience at a music concert, even when you go back and you experience kind of a terrible band, it's still live music. You're still, kind of there. And there's something about that new experience, even though it was inferior, that if it wasn't for the original good experience, you probably wouldn't even want it. You probably wouldn't even want to experience things that way because it's just not that good. But The new experience builds upon and borrows from, and I think that's the key dynamic. It borrows from that original good experience. And this is the case, especially for people who have religious experience. And a religious experience, very much like a philosophical experience or an experience with a really good novel or an experience with really good poetry or something of the kind, it's one of those, and we love to use metaphors with this, right? So it's kind of fun, where we'll say, I didn't really like poetry until one day I found myself, reading it or encountering it in some way, and there was something in there. There was some little piece of it that just kind of came up and slapped me in the face. And it was like, wow, wait a minute, hang on, I really see myself in this. Like that showed me something new. And I think part of what's beautiful about that in philosophy and religion and literature and anything intellectual is that if it shows you something new and you weren't expecting it, then that tells us, well, all kinds of good things could be hiding all over the place. Maybe it's the case that there's a lot of good stuff out there, but I didn't even know enough to be able to see it, that it was hidden in plain sight. And a lot of what happens then in philosophy and literature and, things of that nature, where I read it and it's like, wow, this is incredible with, whatever the subtlety is. And Plato or Heidegger has been more of a recent fascination for me. A lot of people pick it up and it's just not, it's completely off-putting for a variety of reasons. And they don't know enough to even desire it. They haven't had the experience of being able to cut through and actually get just a little spark of understanding. And here, of course, being somebody who studies Meister Eckhart, I have to borrow that word not unintentionally, right? So it's a little spark, and it's a little spark that ignites something. And that fire is the kind of thing, it seems like, for desire that continues to burn. Even much later, 10, 20, 30, 50 years later, you still remember those important experiences. And honestly, I'm starting to think, and this is what's been so impressive to me recently, I'm starting to think that almost everything works like this. That even as small children go out in the world, and characteristically, for a 3-year-old, you just kind of wake up and it's like, wow, everything is new and exciting. And then you go out and you have these experiences, and whether it's an experience with, Hot Wheels car or video games or playing with friends or throwing a football or whatever it is, then from then on, some of that beautiful childlike enthusiasm and joy acts like a kind of contagion for desire. And it's the sort of thing that sticks around long after the initial experience has faded. And so it may even be the case that we don't even remember, and we certainly can't rationalize. This is not a rational thing, right? I mean, when you have an impressive experience, it's not as though you had to think through it, and then all of a sudden, after you finished thinking through it, it was like a math proof. It's like, oh, now I see how it works. Now I'm impressed. But no, it doesn't work that way, right? Impressive experiences are the kind of things that just come up and slap you in the face. They just like dump cold water on your head, and it's like, see? Bet you didn't see that coming. And that's what it's like frequently. Going to, a concert for the first time, going to a giant sporting event for the first time, whether it's a football match, whether that's a, soccer match for Americans or an American football match, whatever it is, some big cultural event. And you go to that big cultural event, and then all of a sudden, you are, primed for that experience. You understand the experience, but you understand it viscerally. You don't necessarily understand it rationally. We might confabulate afterwards and try and tell ourselves stories about what it was that the experience actually was and why it was important and so on. And none of that really matters. It was an impactful experience, no matter what. Now, if it's bad, we call it trauma. But if it's good, depending upon how good it is and what we associate it with sociologically, then we might call it religion. Or we might call it a cult, or we might call it, we have all kinds of different labels just trying to figure out the valence of, what do we really think about this? What do I think about this desire that I find within myself? That now that I have enjoyed this concert experience, or now that I've enjoyed this religious experience, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it something where I was closer to God, or I was, extremely impressed and felt one with the, society and really a sense of belonging? Or do I instead think that I was possessed by demons, or that I, otherwise was involved in some kind of, lascivious desire that I shouldn't have for whatever reason? And so, in other words, it's only after the fact that it fits into a kind of value system. But the impressiveness of the original experience, that's the thing that it imprints, and it stamps upon us some kind of important psychological experience that allows us then to come back and allow future experiences to partially fill that mold. And insofar as they conform to that mold, then it allows us to re-experience that, at least in part, like Cajun spices or a concert or religious experience, and quite honestly, sexual experiences like this too. And so is virtually everything else that we do. Experiencing, let's say, a beautiful landscape or having a really good time hiking, any kind of aesthetic experience, it really helps if you've had a particularly poignant and powerful version of that experience that you can then use to inform all the future experiences. And so you're willing to accept, kind of mediocre hikes through state parks if you've had a really profound and good experience with that, where it was like really fulfilling and beautiful and, whatever it was, whatever the qualities were. Like I said, the story doesn't matter. It's the experience for whatever reason, without any reason, that makes the impact. So anyway, I wanted to point this out, and I wanted to bring this up in the context of what it is that we're doing in general, as far as kind of general psychological dynamics, but in particular with religious experience, because this allows us to sort of bridge the gap in a way that I think William James would have appreciated, in identifying certain impactful experiences, certain experiences that have dynamics in our lives in particular ways that maybe we call them religious, maybe we associate them with a particular religion, or maybe we have no idea what they were, but they just really impress us, and so it's something we're constantly trying to recapture. Like being able to play an instrument that is just extraordinarily beautiful, and then after playing a Bosendorf or something of the kind, like a really expensive, really nice piano, then I might be willing to accept a $5,000 cheap player piano, because I can still at least partially bring back some of the beauty in that experience. And I wonder, as a final thought, I wonder if part of that recapturing of the experience is because we create our own experiences in part. And we do this via a kind of filling in all the gaps. My favorite example of this, of course, is with art. And so this is the perspective that painters capture that typically, photographers don't, because photographers are almost too good in the sense that they pick up everything. They pick up all the details. Our eyes and brains do not pick up all of the details. We're just not that powerful. And so we have to focus on particular things. And the phenomenon is called selective focus. Rembrandt was particularly good at this, and Vermeer was also very good at this. And so you'll notice that frequently there are only just a few fine details in a painting, Rembrandt particularly, like the nose and the eyes and that sort of thing. But, the arm that was kind of pushed into the shadows, especially a deep background, you may only have a few brushstrokes there. There's like nothing. But you know what? That's the way I notice people's shoes too, or that I don't. Like, I have no idea what shoes you're wearing. I mean, honestly, unless they like glow and blink neon or something, I have no idea. And it just doesn't matter. And so there are lots of features like that of the natural world that I just don't see. I just don't experience. And it really just doesn't matter. The last classroom that you were in, what did the door look like? What did the doorknob look like? Even what did the chairs look like? What did the ceiling look like? You probably have no idea, because you didn't really experience it. It was something that got filtered out. It just wasn't important. And so it never entered realistically into your visual field. It might have seemed like it did, in the sense that I could look up and notice what's going on with the ceiling. But if you never did, and there was no reason to, then odds are your experience was actually very, very limited. And here's the key. With then those impactful experiences, when we have an inferior experience in the future, we will take that inferior experience and fill in a lot of the details, I think, in the same way that we do with selective focus. And so we see then and experience a lot of the original goodness, not because it's just sort of like, my red beans and rice is sort of like what we had in New Orleans. No, it's because part of what I experience, and maybe even what my taste buds experience in a very visceral way, is actually borrowed from that original experience. It's just a conjecture. It wouldn't surprise me, but I suspect, especially in the context of something like philosophical, religious experiences, and especially aesthetic experiences, any kind of aesthetic experience, going all the way from sex and chocolate to, the highest in terms of philosophy and religion, because valence is a societal thing that is a confabulation. It's something that happens afterwards. It's not something that is a part necessarily of the initial experience. It's a part of our judgment of that experience afterwards when we get a chance to consciously engage with it. So, in other words, I'm talking about a much more fundamental level in terms of psychological experience. And the fact that we fill in those details is once again the sort of thing that we don't have to rationally do. In fact, you can't rationally do it. You don't have control over that aspect of what it is that the brain does. And I think, in other words, we do it not just with vision, but also with experience, maybe more broadly. Anyway, I hope it's kind of a fun idea. I thought it was curious, and there will be more to follow of that kind of thing with religious experience and philosophy, especially.